Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How y'all doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I'm doing my best and worst shade in the palette series, and today we will be looking at Melt Cosmetics. I do have so many Melt Cosmetics palettes because I love Melt. I'm kind of a stan. And I hope that sounds like something you're interested in. This is a series on my channel that I've been doing quasi one video a month, just kind of going through all of the brands that I have in my collection so that you guys know what my favorite shade and what my least favorite shade in every single palette in those brands are. Sometimes it comes down just to the color of it. Sometimes it comes down to the formulation of it and how it performs. And we have maybe a lot of that in Melt because Melt is kind of a fickle brand that you need to kind of finesse as far as the formulation goes. I do hope that that sounds like something you're interested in. With that said, for those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a lover of all things high and colorful beauty and self-care. And ultimately, this is my self-care, and I love to talk about makeup. So this is why I'm here, and I hope that you find that this channel brings solace to your soul in the way it brings solace to mine, and you'll want to subscribe before you go. All that said and done, no further ado, intro aside, let's jump in to this best and worst shade in the palette for the Melt Cosmetics makeup brand. Today we're going to be going through the Melt Cosmetics brand, and I do have 12 palettes from Melt. I think this is it. I think this is all. Let me go into my spreadsheet and make sure. I do have 12 Melt eyeshadow palettes. So that is what we're working on today, and this is in no particular order. So as you guys know, I go through, I show you the palette, I talk about the palette a little bit, and then I pick my best and my worst shade out of each palette so that you know my favorites. First and foremost, I have this one. This is the Melt Bad Side Zodiac Earth palette. It encompasses Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, and I am a Virgo with a birthday in September, right smack in the middle of Virgo thought process, so definitely a Virgo wholeheartedly. I would say that this is ultimately a decent palette. I don't think that it shares the same formulation as most Melt palettes do. And with that said, I do think that it performs pretty decently, but there is definitely a favorite for me, and that would be this one here, which is called Materialistic. It is just a really beautiful, like, coppery tone, but it is so pretty. And then the least favorite is going to be this yellow here. This yellow is, I mean, not a great yellow, number one. Number two, it is supposed to be like a mustardy yellow, and I 100% understand that. But I also think that there is just a little bit of oxidation that happens with this palette that makes it kind of ugly. You can kind of see it right now. It's kind of turning this like orange color around the perimeter of it, but the inner part of it is still really mustardy yellow. I don't have a problem with a poopy brown, like mustard yellow kind of shade. I don't. I love them actually, but I also think that because it oxidizes, it doesn't do very well in an eye look. If I'm going to blend out any color in this eyeshadow palette with it, I have to be prepared that it is going to turn more orange than it is yellow, and that is kind of just kind of upsetting, right? So the favorite shade is going to be this one here, which is that beautiful kind of like orangey coppery shade. I would say that this isn't like my favorite overall tone in the palette, but this one just performs so beautifully and looks beautiful in an eye look. This one is the worst, and you guys saw, like, it started as a yellow. It doesn't look like a yellow right now, and this is what I mean by it oxidizes. In the center, I think it looks very orange, but on the outskirts, it looks very yellow. And there are still parts of it that look yellow, parts of it that do not. It's just, I mean, ultimately, it's a truly horrible shade. It just feels different in the palette, and it also like just performs differently than the other ones in the palette. So that would be my favorite and least favorite in this palette. And then the next palette we're going to talk about is 420. So this is what the 420 palette looks like, and on the inside is just a very like fall leaves kind of thought process with this palette. I actually quite love this palette during the fall time, and I think I forgot to put it in my favorite fall palettes lineup because it's not in my favorite fall palettes lineup, I don't think. And this is really a beautiful fall eyeshadow palette. So my favorite in this palette is going to be, I mean, this one right here, this beautiful like chartreusey green look at that. It's so beautiful and doesn't really oxidize. And then my least favorite is probably going to be the only metallic or shimmer in the palette, and it is called Shatter, and it looks really good there, but like putting it on, it doesn't look that fantastic. So this is the shade Shotgun, and that is that beautiful chartreusey green, and you can see like just that is the color that this one kind of started out as, and it just doesn't perform that way. And then the one that is the worst is called Shatter, and I just don't feel like it's super impactful. I feel like it is actually kind of a pain in the ass to use. You have to pack so much of it on an eye look to get it to be impactful. It's more of kind of like a toppery shadow, when that's definitely not how it comes across in the like finger swatches of it. Like when you put your finger into it or a brush into it, it really packs on, but then putting it on an eye look, it really kind of doesn't translate on an eye look in the way that you want it to as the only shimmer in this palette. Like it should have some impact, and I just don't think that it does. So those would be my favorites and least favorites from that one. The next palette I have is the Electrip palette, and I have a lot of these palettes still in boxes, and I don't know why. The Electrip is a little bit odd for me. I do think that this is a different formulation for Melt to some extent. The shadows just performed a little bit differently. They were a little bit more buildable versus like pure pigment straight up in your face. I do have two shadows in here that I would consider favorites for me. The first one being Far Out, which is this one here, and the other one being Head Trip, which is this orange here. I do think that this orange for me is more of a favorite, so we are going to swatch that one because I mean, it is just so pretty, and it kind of has this like dual chrominess or shiftiness to it. Not necessarily a duochrome, but definitely a shiftiness to it that I appreciate and love so dang much. And then the least favorite for me is going to be this one here, which is called Reefer. And it is the deeper one in the palette, and one that I feel like needs to perform because it is the deepest one in the palette. That said, I am okay with it not performing super well because I am only putting it into like the outer V of my eyeshadows. So it's not necessary that it be like crazy awesome, right? I just need to be able to build it up. But that is the favorite. That is the shade Head Trip. I mean, how gorgeous is that? And then Reefer is this one. And I just find it to be kind of patchy. And I know that it looks patchy just because it's over the top of like my vein in my arm. But also like look outside of the vein in the arm. Like it's just patchy. It's just a patchy brown. It doesn't perform well at all. It doesn't build well at all. It reminds me of where the rest of this palette feels like maybe a new formula for Melt. That one reminds me of old Melt formula. It also feels very different on the finger when you swatch it. It feels kind of sticky or grippy in the on the finger when you swatch it. That brown just does not perform very well. It actually causes so much muddiness every single time I use it out of this palette. So mostly because I'm trying to build and trying to build and trying to build, and it just doesn't want to work. The rest of them do quite well. Actually, the blues in that palette actually do quite well. I was pretty shocked by it. My next one to speak about is Vida, and I have to be honest with you, I struggle to think of a worse shade in this palette because I feel like every single shade in this palette really does perform quite well. I feel like these feel a little bit different. Like when I go into the two shimmers in this palette, this one and this one here, they feel a little bit more crumbly and a little bit almost sticky, but they perform so dang well. And then the mattes in this palette also perform very well. I do think that Melt does a really good job with greens and oranges and reds, to be honest. But at the end of the day, I did pick like two different shadows for a favorite. And the favorites for me were Mexicana. This red here is a fantastic red. And then Serape, which is the green shimmer. I can't tell you which one is my more favorite, except for if it's a green, it's a green. So I am going to swatch this one, and I think that you guys will see, like when I swatch, I'm pressing my finger in as opposed to dragging, because the drag is going to cause it to be a little bit more crumbly. And I really do feel like it's been that way since I got the palette, not because of its age. This is an elder in my makeup collection. If I am honest, it has been in my makeup collection for quite some time, but it is just a stunning green in my collection. And then for worst, again, I have to go with the deepest shade in the palette, the brown. And again, I am just telling you, like, I don't feel like any of these in this palette specifically are bad. And I think that you can see that in this brown. Like, this brown is not a bad shade. It is not a bad shade. And next to the other brown, paired next to this brown, which is supposed to be the same kind of thought process, I think there you can see just how crappy this brown here is. This is not a bad shade. The reason why I picked it for worst in this palette is simply because of all of the shadows in this palette, this is my least favorite shade. I went into the red, like, because I swatched all these last night as I was prepping for this video, just to remind myself again. I think I thought that the red was going to be the worst because red is pretty, you know, categorically hard to make sure it doesn't really turn to pink, but this red is actually a really stunning red. It actually performs really quite well, and it's a red that does not turn into a pink. See, it does feel a little bit more grippy in the pan, but I think that's because that's a pigment versus a like eyeshadow. I mean, ultimately it just came down to which were my favorite shadows in this palette and which were my least favorite shadows in this palette, and not because they performed poorly, because they just don't perform poorly in that palette specifically. I think, if I remember correctly, these were my first Melt palettes, and they still are my favorite Melt palettes, because the next one we'll talk about is Muerte, and I painstakingly went after getting these palettes. They were the ones that got away for a very long time, and then a friend of mine helped me out. So the next palette I have is Muerte, and Muerte is the other side of that sugar skull, with the dark side of the sugar skull, and it is stunning. It is a stunning eyeshadow palette. I think that, again, like the Vida palette, I really do feel like all of these shadows really do perform quite well in an eye look. When I think about my least favorite in the palette, it is because it is a really not great blue. It performs a lot like this brown does. So this one is my least favorite. My favorite in this palette is going to be Angelito, which is this beautiful like tealy, like turquoisey shimmer shade. I do think that these shimmers are just different in this Vida and Muerte like lineup because they can get a little bit crumbly if you're not careful with them in swatching. You basically need to press instead of swipe. So it is a little discolored down here because I got some green in that swatch. But this one is the blue, and I'm not saying it's a horrible blue. I'm just saying it takes a lot to work with it, and it does tend to be a little bit more on the fickle side to work with. Blues are pretty categorically in my collection not fantastic. I have a couple of blues in my collection that I feel are fantastic blues, but for the most part, I don't know that I've met a blue that's a perfect blue yet. I'm trying to think of some of the blues in my collection, and like I love blue eyeshadow. I am a blue eyeshadow kind of girl, but also not a blue eyeshadow kind of girl, so there's that. I do think that the navy in this palette, this one here, and even this one here, are a lot better than this kind of like brighter, like cobalty blue. I do love this eyeshadow palette, and I do love the blues in this eyeshadow palette, but I think from the perspective of which one is the worst shade, for this one it's about which one I have to finesse the most in this palette, and it's going to be that blue. But this turquoise, I mean, gives me life. It is such a beautiful, beautiful shade. The next palette I have in here is Fatally Yours. Fatally Yours is a newer, I think maybe this one and the Smoke Sessions 2 are the newest ones in my collection. This one is the Bailey Sarian collaboration with Melt, and this one is an all matte eyeshadow palette, which I was a little bit terrified of, if I'm honest with you, because mattes are, you know, some of Melt Cosmetics' most fickle formulas, but also these are dark. These are really dark. I think my least favorite in this palette, and it's just because of what it looks like in the pan versus what it appeared as on the eye, is this like blue, which looks bright and brilliant, but on the eye was just so dark, is how it translated. And then my favorite is this one here for the same reasons. It is such a really beautiful shadow that is really beautiful and dark. I think that the reason why the blue called Kerosene is my least favorite is because I really did expect that it was going to be blue I was going to be able to use to like blend things out, and that's just not how it performed. It just, I couldn't use it to blend out, and truly none of the shadows in this palette are able to be used to blend anything out, because even this light like peachy tone down here, Arsenic, is really rather deep in an eye look. So I would say that of the eyeshadow palettes that I have from Melt, like this one probably was the most doesn't appear on your eye as it does in the Pan palette. And then for favorite, I do have this one here, mostly because it was my favorite one to use in an eyeshadow look, not because it performs super fantastic, to be honest, because none of them really do, in my humble opinion. This wasn't, listen, I love me a Bailey Sarian, but I'm not 100% sold on this palette in a nutshell. You can see it's just so patchy. I would also say that Melt Cosmetics mattes do not swatch well, period. But I really don't think that this palette overall is my most favorite in my collection. Now, I did have the Millennial Pinks, and I think that that one was far worse than this one, but I don't know that I love the formulation of this palette overall. That said, this one is my favorite, and I think just because of the color of it, because it's definitely not about the performance of it, and this one was my least favorite, I think because I wanted it to work very differently with the other shadows in the palette than it did. That said, none of those shadows in that palette were easy to play with. The next one is Gemini and Gemini 2. So these are probably my favorites from the brand. I did get this one when the Gemini 2 released, so it took me forever to decide to pick up this palette. This one, I would say, was a really easy one for me. My favorite being the shade Gemini, which is this one right here. My least favorite being the shade Luna, which is the shade right next to it, the creamy shade, simply because it doesn't show up on my skin. So favorite, least favorite. We have Gemini. Gemini is the favorite. It's just such a beautiful shadow. It does have a little bit of like a kick of gold to it, so it kind of feels flippy and duochromy as well. And then Luna, which on an eye look for me just doesn't show up. I mean, it's a great shade, I guess, for like blending things out because it's so light. It doesn't show up on me, but it's also my least favorite to use because it doesn't really bring anything to an eye look. I'm not a person that uses an eyeshadow to like set my base or anything like that. So I need eyeshadows to appear on my eye looks like eyeshadow, and I just don't feel like that one brings anything to the look of eyeshadow that I'm trying to, the eye look that I'm trying to create with the palette. And then for Gemini 2, this is the more like kind of rosy tone one with that little flash of green in it as well. And this one was also kind of easy for me. For me, my favorite is going to be this shade right here, which is called Schmood. And my least favorite is going to be the one right next to it called Alex Queen, because of the performance of it. I just didn't feel like it was a great performing shadow amongst great performing shadows in this palette. So we have Schmood and we have Alex Queen. Schmood also has that like shifty duochromy like feel to it. It leans very like red, but kind of also looks a little bit orange, with a little bit of orange sparkle in it. It's just a really beautiful shadow. And then we have Alex Queen, which isn't like a horrible eyeshadow, to be honest, but the performance of it was not fantastic in this palette full of really high performing shadows, if I'm honest. It just goes back to what I said about the chocolate shade, from the Vida palette. It is just the least favorite in the palette, not because of anything other than it is the most fickle of the shades and maybe the least used of the shades in this palette. I really firmly love the Gemini and Gemini 2 palettes in the Melt collection, in my Melt lineup. And they're some of my favorites. The next two I have is the Smoke Sessions and Smoke Sessions 2 palettes. And these ones, listen, are fantastic. They're just beautiful eyeshadow palettes. Like, picking my favorite and least favorite in these was hard because I feel like I like every single one of these. Now, most of the Melt eyeshadow palettes have 1 or 2 or at most 3 out of their 10 shades are shimmers. This one is mostly shimmers. It just has the 2 mattes in it, but it does also only have 8 shades. So there's 6 shimmers, 2 mattes, and I think that we all know this, but my favorite is going to be Blue Dream, which is beautiful. And my least favorite is going to be Gravity OG. And Gravity OG is simply because this is a shade that I don't love using in my everyday life. These shadows are very, very fragile. So you have to go into them really, really easily. Now, Gravity OG is also a shadow in this palette that I feel like you really have to dig into to get what you want to out of it. That is the Blue Dream shadow, just a really beautiful soft tealy shade. And then this one is Gravity OG, which again, I just feel like you have to dig, like this is me, number one, putting 2 coats over the top of it, which isn't unheard of for a shimmer, but also me really putting my finger into that palette in order to get some payoff from that shadow. And look at how much is left on my finger. Like, I just feel like it doesn't adhere as much as you want it to, but also for me, it's really about the color, because it's just not a color that I love using in eyeshadows. I don't love golds, and that's kind of very gold. The next one is the Smoke Sessions 2, and for me this one was just a stellar palette. I loved having this in my rotations. I loved using this so much. This one was a hard one to pick again because it just had to be about which one I liked using least, because I really did love this palette and all the eye looks that came of it. But I would say that this one here is my favorite. This is called Blue Haze. And this purple is probably my least favorite, which is the deepest, darkest, like almost black purple. And I feel like that's why it was my least favorite. It was just a black. It didn't show up in an eye look as a purple, and I really wanted it to be purple. So that is Blue Haze. And I think that you guys maybe could see the reason why I love this shadow. It just looks like it's backlit. It is so, so pretty. And then the one that I liked the least is this purple called Purple Punch. I wouldn't necessarily say it's an awful purple, but in an eye look, this just looks black, and I really want it to look purple. On my swatch, it looks very purple, but in an eye look, it just looks black. I wanted it to bring more specifically to this palette. And then lastly, I have my Halloweentown and Christmastown palettes. And I'm glad it's the last ones because I am just really getting eyeshadow everywhere. Let's talk about Christmastown first. So Christmastown looks like this. It's a beautiful eyeshadow palette. I love Nightmare Before Christmas. I love this palette, if I'm honest with you. This one was actually really easy for me to decide which one was my favorite and which one was not. My favorite is going to be this one here. That is Sugar Plum Visions, and my least favorite is going to be this green down here, which is called Smithereens. I love greens. I don't love this green. So Sugar Plum Fairies kind of reminds me of this shadow here, in that it kind of has this like backlit feel to it, but it's a little bit lighter of a purple. But I think that you can see that. It also feels like it's got this like neon backlighting to it. The Smithereens is just a really horrible green. It really is. It's just a really horrible green. Now, it looks fantastic in this swatch, but when you blend it out, it just gets muddy and less evergreeny and more like camo. And I really wanted it to be like green, like straight up green, because I feel like that's what would look good with these shadows here. I will say that this also is not a fantastic red. It's not like this red, but that green, in my humble opinion, was the one that I loved working with the least. I also feel like these two palettes, Christmastown and Halloweentown, like some of their colors should have been in each other's palette, like color swap. Like if they were magnetic, I would probably color swap some of the colors in these palettes, because I just felt like they performed better with some of the shadows in the other palette versus their own palette. This one is Halloweentown. Like when I think of the purples in the Christmastown palette, I think that they belonged in here. Now that said, I think that these purples in here are a little bit, for the most part, more cool toned than the purples that were in the other palette. But there should be some color swapping that can happen in these palettes to make them look and perform better. For me, this one was a little bit easy as well. Mausoleum as my favorite, and I have Oogie Boogie as my least favorite. Now, Oogie Boogie is listed as my least favorite because of the color of it. To be honest, this also is a shade that gets hard pan pretty easily, but it is a shade that's supposed to be chartreuse, and it is just more yellow than it is chartreuse. So this one is Mausoleum. Mausoleum just feels so like silky and smooth and beautiful, and it is such a pretty tone of like turquoisey greeny blue. And then this one is Oogie Boogie, and next to this green, I feel like it maybe looks chartreuse, and you all are like, Donna, you're crazy, but it doesn't look chartreuse in an eye look. And not next to Smithereens, it doesn't look green at all. It looks very gold. So again, it just comes down to color story for me for that one. I think that all of the shadows in this palette are really very good, actually. Even this deep dark purple, which is something that I don't know that I think that Melt does really well from a matte standpoint, is deep dark purples, which is very sad because I really do love their formulation, but those ones are typically the worst ones to have to finesse. But with that said, of my Melt palettes, this is my favorite shadow in every single palette. There's only 3 mattes in these choices, which is so funny because Melt's palettes are mostly mattes and only a few shimmers. And on the other end of the spectrum, these are my least favorites. Now, I wouldn't mind this color story in a palette, honestly, if they were better shades. And when I look at this brown next to this brown, like, y'all, those were the same color of brown. So there's that. I really do love Melt's formula. I would say there's nothing that I don't like about Melt's formula, if I'm honest. I don't care that you have to like finesse it just a little bit. That's never steered me clear of Melt's formula. I'm okay with it. I can work slowly. I do like straight up pigmentation. I do like a little bit of being able to blend it out though, and I think when I think of all the things about Melt Cosmetics, I would say that is the biggest qualm I have with Melt Cosmetics, is that they're hard to blend because they're straight up pigment in your face, and even the lighter tones look dark in an eyeshadow. And the light ones are usually the ones that are the shimmers. But isn't that a beautiful color story? A beautiful set of shadows from this brand. I think that this one is probably the worst performing of them all, but that is one of the mattes. The two other mattes in here, really beautiful. And I just want you to look at this one here, which has maintained its chartreusey, bright orangey or bright yellowy green nature. It hasn't oxidized at all. And then look at this one that has changed color even since I swatched it out the first time. So that is why it's on my least favorite list. But those are my colors. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to give it a big thumbs up. I really appreciate you guys doing it. Please don't forget to comment down in the comment section to help me out with the algorithm. And you know, I just hope that you guys are doing well. I hope that you are all safe and healthy and getting along as best that you can. I hope that you are all loving each other, being kind humans, and living your best life. And until next time, bye friends.